Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Phoebe Benich. I'm a fellow with Carnegie Mellon's Institute for Strategy and Technology. Most recently served at the White House Office of National Cyber Director, and I'm here with my CMIST colleague, Emma.
Hi, I'm Emma Stewart from both Idaho National Lab and a non-resident fellow with CMIST also.
Great. So today we're going to be talking about our recent paper, Electrotech Moneyball, which we describe as an industrial strategy for ranking risk and opportunity in energy and AI supply chains. So first, we're going to walk through the baseline, talk about what Electrotech is, why it's so important in this moment. Then we'll walk through the unique risks facing our Electrotech supply chain, the framework that we built to help policymakers assess that risk and prioritize which components to give special attention, investment, protection, and then next steps for government and industry. Great.
Okay, so to tell a little story, a lot of this work was born not just at Carnegie Mellon, but in work that we were doing together at Office of National Cyber Director as well, back a few years ago. We all met and had a discussion about batteries. I think at the time, batteries were on this sort of big focus list. And there was a number of discussions of, hey, we're going to ban all these companies. The first thing most of us said, hey, by the way, you know, that's the biggest battery supplier in the world, and we actually need those for supplying the electric grid. And so there was a sort of long discussion of what the batteries actually meant to the grid and how they were connected and what really mattered for the cyber side of that as well. Harry, who isn't here, but Harry, I think he coined the term the electrolyte goo that we've now adopted. So we started to explain the difference between electrolyte, things that are not really active control components, and control components and what those meant from a cybersecurity perspective. So that's really how we started to get to here of how we come up with more, what's the word? Sorry, I'm running out of words again today. But how we come up with a scalpel rather than a hammer to work out what are the PCs we should be manufacturing here? What are the PCs we should be manufacturing elsewhere? Where do we rely on that? And how do we actually come up with a more cohesive framework rather than sort of the ban hammer being used all the time? So the Electrotech stack was the coined phrase for this, which is really, we're under this sort of fundamental shift. I think you've probably heard people talk about it already, but a fundamental shift in how we deliver power and what sort of power we're actually trying to deliver, where essentially everyone's heard about the data center boom, where essentially our load is changing and much, much faster than it has ever changed before. I've been in this industry about 23 years, not to show my age, but 23 years. And in that time, it's gone from we'll talk about one thing for 20 years and not necessarily adopt it, to a point of the last 3 years where we've got new transmission lines, new data centers, new loads, new types of control. So that's really that stack that we're talking about, is all of these brand new components. That stack is also an opportunity. If we're going to install lots of brand new things, probably one time in our generation, if you've ever worked with sort of utilities in the electric sector in particular, they do move fast, but not as fast as you might imagine to install things. So if we're going to install brand new things all over the place and really upgrade our electric system to have these brand new loads, how do we help people make the right decisions in those purchases so that 20 years from now, when I am hopefully not here talking about this, we will have put the right things in place and I will not be worrying about it anymore. But the time is now, because whatever we install now is going to be there for a long time. I think there's an impression that we might, in a few years be able to rip and replace it. It's not really viable. So we will be seeing these components for much longer than you can imagine at this point. So that's the stack and why it really matters to us, because it will control how we deliver power for a very long time.
And I would just add too that just to underline that not only are these aren't just energy technologies. The Electrotech stack, the important characteristic of it is that it builds the ingredients for defense tech, transportation, comms, etc. So this is, as you can see from this fun graphic, the components that we're talking about, which are highly relevant for energy technologies, are also crucial to other sectors.
Yeah, so I mentioned like how big this actually is. And so this is some examples of sort of the volume of components we're seeing. I gave a talk at B-Sides last year that was about B-Sides Vegas last year about data centers in particular and sort of the size that they are in comparison to our electric grid. I coined the term Scotland. There are sizes of Scotland being installed. Everyone's met the Scottish soccer fans recently, so I can talk about it. But the size of a country is being installed in Virginia in the next 2 to 3 years. That's not small. That's an enormous load growth that we've not really seen happen before in this sort of revolution that we're going through. So I think latest numbers, which change daily, are things like 5,400 data centers being installed with like 3,000 different sites currently under construction. Some of these numbers are actually imaginary because people put things onto a queue also, and you'll say, oh, but we didn't install 5,000, we installed 3,000. Yes, but that's still a giant number. Also, with about 12% of our electricity share by 2028 will come from these sort of large loads and this grid build out as well, which is enormous. But the bottleneck is real for this. Everyone is looking for components to actually get these installations to happen. Transformer shortages have been talked about for probably about 5 to 10 years at this point of we can't get transformers now. They take 3 years to build. How are we going to do this? That's still there. That problem is still here. We're just coming up with novel ways to actually deal with that. So,
great. I'll just use this. Right. So we're facing this unprecedented infrastructure build out driven by AI, and this build out is largely a digitization of our energy infrastructure. Increasingly, we're seeing these behind the meter devices, these distributed devices that are extremely software native and networked by design, which makes them more secure, but also puts them outside of the traditional governance mechanisms that we have for a lot of our typical energy distribution and sector organizations. We think, we talk about how, NERC CIP, for example, wasn't designed for the types of technologies that we're seeing deployed across the grid all the time. So the governance needed for these new components, these new Electrotech components, is lagging behind the build out that we're currently seeing at the pace that Emma described. Great. Yeah, okay, great. So a lot to dig into here then. So we talk about how we have this great opportunity. Electrotech can potentially make our grid more secure, but if sourced without scrutiny or governed without standards, our more digital grid can potentially open up new attack vectors. And we think it's really important to be precise about the specific types of threat that we're talking about, because all too often people will throw around the term supply chain security, and policy will collapse into one solution that actually addresses none of the problems correctly. So we talk about 3 different types of threat and how we want to distinguish between those in our policymaking. First is the economic dependency risk, with China controlling massive swaths of our Electrotech stack. The consequences of this kind of risk, though, are longer term. If we, trade with China ceases, or they start sinking our cargo ships, the solar panels and the batteries that we've already deployed in the United States will continue to function and generate electricity, but it'll be a crisis of future deployment in terms of the new shipments that we're cut off from. On the other hand, a cybersecurity risk, this could be an immediate consequence for our grid. So hijacking fleet orchestration software can immediately destabilize grid balancing. We think, though, in the paper, it's important to point out that these kinds of Volt, Salt, Typhoon actors are real, but maybe the worst case scenario. A more realistic and third threat that we talk about is that of firmware dependency. So with China controlling massive swaths of our Electrotech stack, the products that we have deployed come with firmware, which gives Chinese vendors, access to these products years after the sale, often for routine diagnostics and updates, but still with that potential access to be leveraged for malicious purposes. And so when we're talking about risk in our supply chains, it's important to be clear whether we're talking about that economic dependency, supply chain cutoff, versus cyber access that could be deployed immediately. And as we say on the slide, the wrong answer is to treat everything as equally risky. We think the most strategically underweighted risk to our Electrotech stack doesn't necessarily come from China, but from our own self-inflicted paralysis. If we're using blanket restrictions and treating every Chinese component or technology as equally dangerous, we both fail to secure the technologies that actually matter, those control layers, and also throttle our own build out by failing to access the commodities that we need for this infrastructure. So this is sort of the conundrum that frames our thinking with the Moneyball framework, which I'll get to now. Oh, but Emma has, go ahead.
To add one point on the bans and rip and replace type approaches. A number of years ago, as a story, everyone heard about Huawei. We were banning Huawei, we were going to rip and replace them. That was the grand plan. For understandable reasons. There was good reason for that to happen. So don't let me take away from why that happened. But we get to a few years ago, probably last year, in fact, when we actually had been doing some of this work. And there's a couple of things popped up in the media about essentially the Pentagon was asking for an exemption from the rip and replace because they'd not yet been able to source better or new components to replace that or fund the replacement of these at multiple locations. At one point when this ban happened and the rip and replace, there was a request for budget to do that across the country. I think the estimate that came in was somewhere on we need $4 billion to actually do this replacement. They put one towards it essentially. And when we get to this point, there is no money left to do that replacement. Asking the consumers to take on that cost is significant. So how do we actually get to the point of making a more sort of strategic ban on these things or a strategic replacement over time rather than looking at doing this kind of, we're going to straight up do this and then not achieve it approach as well. The other part of the sort of Huawei ban that was interesting that's relevant to this, we talk about inverters a lot here. So the control layer for these components. Inverters themselves, Huawei is the got global supplier of inverters in the world. They still are. But after that ban happened, they were actually number 2 in the world. They got banned in the US and became number 1 in the world for supplying inverters. So there's kind of a strange approach there. Again, I'm not saying they necessarily were doing anything good, but the banning them didn't have the effect we thought it would have strategically. Most of Europe can still buy all these components. It didn't really change the approach. So, but broad bans or broad rip and replace don't tend to have the actual impact we think they do over time.
Great. So we developed this Moneyball framework. We focused a lot in our discussion on the risks, but actually the assessment of risk is only 1/3 of the initial assessment. We think it's important not only to be making our supply chain decisions based on where risk lies, but also opportunity. So the first question we ask is, how urgent is the deployment of this component? Is this something that we need immediately for our AI build out or other electrification of society? Or is this something that we can take time in investing in? Second, where does that technical risk lie and what's the blast radius if that component were to become compromised? This is really looking at where does this component live on the smart to dumb spectrum? Are we talking about the battery management systems, the firmware, the fleet orchestration software, or are we talking about, as Emma described, that electrolyte goo inside the battery? Very different levels of risk and potential damage to the rest of the system. And third, this is the opportunity side. This is, does US or allied leadership in this component confer industrial advantage? So is this a component or an industry which we would want to be investing in such that it benefits not only our energy sector, but we could utilize this across defense, transportation, et cetera? Or is this more uniquely beneficial to one sector? And so based on this assessment, we have 3 tiers for ranking Electrotech components. First, where we want to maintain close domestic control and sourcing. Those are our most tightly controlled layers that we care most about. Second, where we can start incorporating trusted allies and partners into our sourcing decisions and coordinate supply chains together. And then third, where we can accept a little bit more risk into that sourcing. This is managed global procurement, where with transparency and testing requirements, we can start incorporating these components from potentially volatile suppliers.
So the case study we use, again, there are lots of components in this list. We've just been using batteries, solar, and inverters because we have a lot of data on that just now. But there's a number of the components on this list is extensive. It's not just these components. When we talk about these two case studies, this was really talking about what is smart and what is dumb. So essentially, if you look at the battery, we have the dumb physical battery. It's the actual electrolyte. It's what generates the DC, but it's the electrolyte that sits within the particular system. There's the smart-ish control layers. There's the local hardware controls that don't necessarily talk outwards. And then there's the actual smartest layer, which is where we've got the bigger consequence, where there's cloud integration. I think Ginger actually talked about a lot of this in her talk, which is excellent. The cloud integration, the grid management, the advanced distribution management systems, and the sort of remote update capability that comes through and connects those all together is where the sort of larger consequence and attention can be given to the firmware, software, hardware that's being built on. But when you look at the sort of passive components, there was actually a huge focus on building solar panels in the US over the past 10 years. There's been a decent amount of movement towards that. But again, that was also just essentially a layer of silicon that was being sold. And China had dominated that market about 15 years ago, imported exceptional amounts of, quite honestly, not well-made solar panels, which over the years actually improved, but they were not well made at the time. I'd worked in the solar industry. They were just coming in broken. And because they were cheap, you could replace them. That being said, they weren't incredibly smart components. With the smart layer on top of that, that's really the inverters and PCs. So we can treat these all slightly differently from the sort of goo type components. Those are really sort of in the economic risk perspective, where we get the materials there. That's important economically, not necessarily that important from the technical control layer component wise. Then up to the sort of things that we do care about on the very smart level with the firmware, the sort of things that we can use to block any other risk. That's where we really care.
Yeah, and I think that these images really highlight the important point, I think that we'll just continue to reiterate, which is like getting into the policy next steps, which is we can't be governing at the product level. We must be breaking this down into the sub-product component level. Policy that restricts along the product lines has that same lose-lose that I offered earlier, which is that it both fails to actually secure the layers that matter and actually throttles the build-out we need.
So one of the last outcomes we were going to talk about was that using this sort of control layers as a fire break between what we care about and what we don't effectively. One other challenge with sort of the control layers, if it doesn't really matter if it's built here or built in China, if it is insecure by design anyway. So one of the parts is how do we make sure we come up with this fire break having secure designs in itself, while also being built in the right places with the right kinds of approaches put into that as well. So that's really what we're talking about there, is how do we create blockers between the challenges as well, so the system works appropriately, but also is effectively protected from the worst case scenarios also. So engineering controls.
Great. So we talk about how there are we're going to time a few different horizons of policy that we recommend. Because of the Moneyball framework, the goal is to buy us time so that we're controlling the most urgent components, but giving us time to then invest in the other supply chain industries that matter. So the first layer, wanting to secure those distributed energy resources now. So that means updating NERC SIP guidance to apply that to behind the meter and distributed energy resources. NERC SIP being designed for large load doesn't necessarily provide the same nuance to these new devices that are coming onto the grid. Second, aligning our policy tools to recalibrate foreign entities of concern and other rules to these more nuanced Moneyball tiers, rather than that product level category that we've been talking about this whole presentation. And then third, this is the longer term industrial strategy. So working with our allies and partners to coordinate on comparative advantages and ensuring that we're aligning on the tier 1 and tier 2 technologies that are important for us to be sourcing amongst one another, as opposed to all of us discovering we have the same vulnerability within the supply chain and failing to build infrastructure that is secure. So these next few slides are sort of just a summary of what is needed, what are next steps for the framework, applying this sort of tiered matrix to policymaking decisions, perhaps leveraging this kind of approach to more finely tuned procurement restrictions for perhaps like the Pentagon specifically, not necessarily banning outright imports from China of products that we view as tier 1, but perhaps like within specific use cases, setting that kind of limited product restriction for DOW, and then letting that serve as an example for other sectors of what is considered most important control layer, et cetera. Yeah, and so we think just pretty simply, this framework can be a tool for policymakers as we're muddling through the challenges facing our Electrotech build out, and can potentially serve as a market signal for hyperscalers. So not only, I think important to note that it's not necessarily only on government to be driving some of these decisions. As we all know, the capital S standards process can take far longer than the industry decisions that are being made right now. And so getting together, similar to how Google decades ago decided to pay a green premium to ensure that the energy it was supplying was climate friendly, getting that kind of voluntary agreement from hyperscalers and their power purchase agreements to ensure that specific control layers are sourced with scrutiny, and leveraging the most agreed upon standards for those kinds of technologies.
I think that might be us. Thank you. So,
okay, any questions?
Love this work. Loved breaking it down. Is this an area where a hardware bill of materials would be helpful, or have I wasted the last year of my life?
It's a really, really deep question, Hal.
So they're two separately.
I don't know if we can comment on how you've used your time, but
no, the hardware bill of materials is where this would be going, but explainable hardware bill of materials from the people understanding what the PCs are, at least on the second, third levels down, as opposed to sort of the name on the tin that comes in as well. So yes, you have not wasted your life, Alan.
Last year.
This is slightly niche, but you piqued my curiosity with your discussion of the data centers. To what extent do you think there'll be a recalibration from the push toward more computing at the edge and processing at the edge, and the arrival, hopefully, unless they get bought up and killed, the arrival of model routing AI tools that seek to more efficiently use power?
The technology is going to change rapidly over the next few years. That being said, if we don't do the initial build out, then we will never get to the point where the technology changes over the years. I think there is a big risk that we end up with things that are lower power density, but we've created this massive amount of density for it as well. That being said, it's going a direction now, and we're going to go with it. That's like, I think they're going to keep going with that direction, and there's so much money pouring into those that I think there'll be tiers of computing also that come from different power capabilities. So I think we'll get there, but it's, the speed of the things are moving, that risk is going to have to be absorbed by people with a whole lot more money than me. So
on that front about the model writing, I think one of the things that's going to be emerging sooner than later is the ability to pack more intelligence into a more dense form. It's already happening now, and with RSI starting to pick up, I think it's entirely possible that we'll have a glut of energy or data centers in the near future as well.
Thanks for the presentation. You have presented, I think, a compelling policy framework, and props to you for starting from some pretty complicated niche knowledge and boiling it down to something that the policymakers are going to be able to take action on. Could you talk a little bit about where you think awareness and uptake on the policy front is right now? Are there kind of hotspots or states or other areas where you think that they're starting to get it and starting to do it, or are we still at the pretty close to the beginning?
From the sort of states level, there's a number of sort of front leaders in really looking at supply chain constraints and hardware for this new effort as well. There's a couple of folks that are really getting ahead, but that being said, that doesn't really help us from the how do we nationally explain sort of demand signals, how people can build, what they should be building. Each state doing it differently will not really help us convene that together. Having said, on the national scale, there is, I think in the original notes, I have something called "It's Ban Season," because we're back about once a year. This comes up that we're gonna ban a whole class of components that would disrupt certain types of deployment at the moment. There's a sort of degree of political and technical sway going on there. That's which risk are we actually looking at? Is it just that we don't really like solar energy just now, or we're just changing that? So that is happening, and so that's really sort of the timing of this is around, hey, we should probably explain what all these components are also, rather than just doing sort of the broad movements. One thing I'm fairly proud of from our perspective is people actually learned what an inverter was. And I can tag Phoebe, Harry, and
confirm
others.
at risk of jeopardizing the credibility of the presentation, I did not know what an inverter was before I met Emma. So,
but then you explained it to all sorts of people, and now
right.
lots of people know what
Now
inverters are.
we're spreading the gospel.
Okay, any other questions? All right, great. Thanks, Phoebe. Thanks,
you.
Emma.